you know, looking for problems. So my presentation goes through 10 mistakes that you can make when you're starting up your company. And that's the way that we'll talk about the things that you should try and make sure aren't going to show up in your due diligence. So we'll walk through that, and then there's question time. I know from experience, I'm not going to see your questions in the chat while I'm presenting. So by all means, throw them in the chat and we'll answer them after the fact, but I will likely not see them while we go, just because it's hard to pay attention to everything. All right, hopefully I don't mess this up because I'm not doing so many Zoom presentations anymore. Do we have my presentation now?
Looks great.
Okay, let's make sure I can change pages too.
Okay, there you go.
We're good? Okay. All right, so let's walk through these top 10 mistakes and then think about how that would show up in your due diligence process if you have made them. So number one is to not be starting your company on your employer's time, equipment, or IP. So this happens more frequently if you're a first-time founder and you have started the company because something that you're working on in your current workplace makes you think of another solution that might be aligned, hopefully not competitive, because that would be really bad. But you've got to be really, really careful that if you are starting your company while you still have your job, let's call it a side hustle, that you are making sure that there's a really clear divide, because you will have questions about this in due diligence if it's obvious that you've started your company while you are still working somewhere else. So they're going to want to make sure that you've answered those questions. And if, let's see, it's as simple as looking at your LinkedIn profile, it's really clear that you're doing something and the time overlap might have indicated that there could be a problem with your past employer. They're going to want to know answers about what was your employment agreement? Do you have sign off from your previous company that this isn't competitive? Investors don't want to invest in a company that is going to get challenged down the road by your previous employer, that they actually own the intellectual property for the company that you've started up. So look, if this is a concern for you, look at your employment agreement. It's possible that you've signed an IP assignment agreement that you didn't read very thoroughly, and it says anything that you dream up while you're working for the company belongs to them. That's probably overreach on their part, but you might have signed them because I've seen them. So you want to be really careful that if there is that overlap, that you're able to answer that particular question. And we can dive into that with anybody that has specific questions. I won't belabor it in case nobody in the room is remotely concerned about it. But you definitely don't want to use their computer to code if you still have another job. That's an easy one. Okay, the next big mistake that's made, and you want to make sure that your paperwork doesn't reflect this or reflects that this is not the case, is that you didn't start the company, particularly pre-incorporation, in such a way that you had other people involved with it that are no longer with the team. This can happen whether you're, coming out of a university incubator style issue, or if you're just working with a number of people, maybe coworkers on something. Your investor wants to know that there isn't anybody hanging around in the background that might step up and say, I was part of that business and I got shut out of it, but I have a claim to some of this business that and this idea for this company. So nobody wants that kind of problem hiding in the background. So if that is the case, there's ways to solve that. You can have a release signed by the person that they don't have any interest. If you know that there is somebody out there harboring those sorts of beliefs that they have an interest in the business and they're not a shareholder, and you're worried about them stepping up when the business becomes successful, and you don't think you can get a release from them, then maybe you give them a small ownership interest in the company to make sure that that's not going to be an issue, and you can answer that question. Now, how is an investor going to know that that's the case if you don't tell them? Okay, probably they won't, unless the person somehow is, out on social media or otherwise speaking about it. But know if you've got that kind of skeleton sort of hanging around in the background of your company, that's not something you want coming out in the future, and it should be dealt with in advance. Okay, one of my favorites, my image for this is the bored cat, because this has got to be one of the most boring things ever to talk about, is the incorporation of your company. If you have incorporated your company on your own, or if you've incorporated with a company with an advisor that doesn't regularly work with startups that are going to seek financing, then it's probably a good idea to get some advice before you go for financing on whether you're set up correctly for this type of investment round. So for example, if you've incorporated on your own or with some support from somebody who doesn't necessarily work with startups, they might have issued 10 shares, or you might have issued yourself 1 share. Or you might have not issued shares at all, because if you did it on your own, you might not know yet that setting up your minute book is an important thing. You want to make sure that your directors that are documented are still directors, they've been elected. You've got to create a minute book. Again, it's hard to imagine talking about a more boring topic than this, but if you haven't gone through a due diligence process yet, and in particular, if you haven't worked with a team that's used to supporting startups, it's worthwhile looking at this, because it really can get the due diligence process off on the wrong foot with people, that your company just doesn't look right. You don't have the minute book, you're missing resolutions, you don't have registers and ledgers, which is really just your spreadsheet of who owns shares and who are in officer and director positions. So getting all of that right is important for looking to investors, that you know what you're doing and that you have the right advisors in place. And so issuing shares, I mentioned you've issued 1 share or 10 shares. When you're going into an investment round, you want to have hundreds of thousands or millions of shares issued to founders, because you need to be able to dilute the company by bringing investors in. So if you're sitting there with 100 common shares to each founder, this is probably something you want to change up before you get to the investor round. It's fine, like that alone isn't going to turn off an investor, but you're going to have to fix it before they come in, because nobody wants to invest $1 million in your company and get 1 share for 10%, because everybody has 10 shares. So we just need numbers we can work with, because everyone's going to be diluted with subsequent fundraising rounds. So that's something that you need to have right out of the gate. Okay, this is something that you don't necessarily need as you go into your first round of due diligence, but it is something that you can expect to maybe be raised by your potential investors. And that's a way to restrict even the founder shares. And what the investor wants to know is that 1 or more of your founders isn't going to abandon the company and still have a big stake in the company, but have decided they're moving across the world to take up surfing, and they still own 1/3 of the company. So there's various ways to do that and to deal with that. And you can wait until you're into the investment round and the investor says, listen, we want a reverse vesting agreement on the founders, or we want a voting trust, or we'd rather, particularly, if you don't have the right number of shares issued already, You could say, okay, we're gonna give the founder stock options. For the most part, it would be with the founders, you would be doing something like a reverse vesting, which is just a hold on the shares you have already, and you have to sell them back if you leave the company early. A voting trust would just say, if you leave, sure, you've helped build the company already. We're not going to ask for your shares back, but we don't want to be trying to track you down with this huge shareholding that you have to vote on things. You're going to have to assign the votes for your shares to somebody else. So do you need these things in advance, and do you need to have them in your data room? Not necessarily, but know that it is coming. And if it's something that you can anticipate is an issue, it's maybe something to talk to your advisors about whether you should do it now. Okay, so the not planning for a breakup is another thing you have to be very careful of, but probably when we're talking about it in the context of an investment round, you're almost certainly going to be redoing this paperwork along the lines that the investor wants to see. So if we weren't, like, if you're not in the middle of an investment round, you should have a shareholder agreement, even if there's two of you. In fact, especially if there's two of you, you need to have a way to deal with the breakup of the business. And somebody leaving for completely, innocuous purposes. Somebody gets sick and they can't, they can't participate as one of the founders anymore. You need to have that kind of paperwork in place. If you don't have it already, going into an investment round, particularly if you're very early stage, probably doesn't look terrible. But if you've been around for several years and you're not sure how long it's going to take for the fundraising round to close, I strongly suggest you get a shareholder agreement in place. What it will look like coming out of the investment round will depend upon the investors and what their demands are. It might be a single agreement. It might be a set of multiple voting rights agreements and various investor rights agreements. So you don't, I would never suggest to somebody on the verge of an investment round to try and anticipate what your investor is going to want to see in those documents. Almost certainly you're going to be wrong, because every investor is slightly different. And that's what we do all day, is refine those agreements for investor preferences. So I wouldn't suggest you try and anticipate it. But if you're not closing around soon and you don't have some sort of agreement in place, absolutely need to get it in place as soon as possible. Okay, a really common mistake that's made with a company is to forget that even the founders need to have fundamental agreements in place. So you may be a very conscientious founder and start hiring contractors or employees and make sure that they have IP assignments agreements and employment and contractor agreements, but even founders should have written agreements in place. Definitely on the IP assignment agreement, but there should also be employment and contractor agreements. And they're very, very commonly forgotten because you're the founder. Why would you need an agreement? Well, once people start putting money into the company, those agreements absolutely need to be in place. And I do recommend that those get put in place in advance of your due diligence. It's possible your investors will have different terms that they want to see in those, but it's almost certain if you don't have them, they're going to want them put into place. The other thing that I'll focus on here, because I don't think it's really covered in another slide. If you have come out of any kind of environment where somebody else owns your IP, so academic or clinical relationship where you're commercializing research-based intellectual property, you definitely need your agreement in place going into your due diligence with the owner of that intellectual property. It might be a license agreement, and you might have been able to actually buy the IP and have a full assignment of the IP, but it's more likely to be a license agreement. So that also needs to be done. If as a founder, you don't actually own your IP, those agreements need to be in place as well. But if you're in that environment, I'm sure you're very aware of that already. Okay, whoops, sorry about that. Not maintaining your record. So even if you've incorporated correctly, and you've gotten everything done correctly, making sure that your paperwork is correct and up to date is really important in the due diligence process. Again, it shows an investor that you are conscientious and that you are on top of the record keeping. One of the key mistakes that can be made in the very early stages is if you brought money into the company and it hasn't been well documented, it really needs to be nailed down what that is. So if that's a founder loan, was it a loan? Was it paying for shares? It's very common that you've thrown $10,000 or $50,000 of your own money in, and that hasn't been documented. So if it's a shareholder loan that's going to be repaid, it should be documented. If it's going to be, sometimes they want that converted to shares, that's fine. Very importantly, if the money hasn't come from the founders, if it's come from friends or family, often it's really very common to have taken money from friends or family, particularly family, and if it's written down anywhere, it's definitely not on a share purchase agreement. It's, scribbled somewhere. You can have 5% of the company. That sends complete shivers down my spine. Please don't sell percentages of your company. So we need to go back and absolutely very clearly document what that money was for. Did it purchase shares? Did it purchase a right to have shares in the future under a safe document or a convertible note? Whatever the money that came into the company was for, maybe everybody's expectations about that weren't clear at the time because they were friends and family that were just being supportive of you. But once you get to outside money, they want to know, does that person have an ownership interest in the company? Do they own shares? Did they loan you money? Was there interest? So if any money has come into the company, it has to be cleared up what it was for, and make sure there's paperwork to support it, to support the characterization of that money. Not securing your brand and IP. So making sure that you can answer questions that people have about if you've shared any intellectual property with people, did you have confidentiality agreements in place? If you have something that might be patentable, have you had an early discussion with a patent professional about that? And have you taken steps to protect your brand? And often in the very early stages, you haven't taken the steps to protect your brand because maybe you're not totally sure that that brand is going to stick yet. You've sort of thrown a name on your company, and then as you develop a brand, you've actually used a different word. It's completely common to totally change your brand over time. But if that brand is key to your product, then you really need to be careful about having showing that you've secured your trademarks, and potentially internationally as well, if that's important. If you can easily rebrand your product and most of your focus is on the product development, potentially less important. Okay, this also goes along with that record keeping piece. And it goes to it. A few of you mentioned you've done friends and family rounds. Making sure that, again, that paperwork is in place, accurately represents what the investment intention was. Was it buying shares? Ideally, if somebody did think they were buying shares and you thought you were selling shares, it's been accurately documented what the value of those shares was, and also making sure that you've sold shares to people that you were allowed to sell shares to. I can do an entire presentation on who you're allowed to sell shares to, so I won't go down that hole. But if you're remotely concerned about whether they actually fell into the category of friends and family, or whether they were accredited investors, those are some questions to answer in advance of having that looked at. So there's lots of exemptions that allow you to sell shares to people without listing them on a public exchange. As I'm sure you know, this is what we're doing here. That's what we're aiming for, is selling shares under those sorts of circumstances. But often in those early stages, you might have sold shares to somebody that wasn't necessarily qualified to be sold shares to. So if you have any potential problems there, you want to know about them in advance. A friend of a friend is a good example of somebody that might not have been entitled to buy shares from you. And then moving beyond the founders, making sure that as you do start bringing on those team members, that you have everything documented. This is your data room right here. Every investor wants to know that you've got enforceable signed contracts with employees and contractors, that there's IP assignments in there, if there's stock option plans, that is well documented. A common pitfall is that you make an offer letter to somebody and you never go any further. The offer letter contains a promise of some shares. It's not clear whether they're stock options or shares, and the offer letter doesn't form, well, it forms to some degree an employment contract, but it's not a full employment contract. So if you have anything sitting out there where you gave an offer letter to somebody and the full documentation hasn't been completed, those are things you want to know and fix before they're showing up in your data room. And literally go through the checklist of every single person, because I've been in many data rooms where it's all over the place, and there's a few contracts for some people, there's offer letters for other people, there's stock options for somebody, and there's no corresponding contract with them anywhere in the data room. Those are all things you can fix in advance of having somebody go through your data room, and you should. If somebody's left and you didn't have a contract for them, but they might still have stock options, or their stock option agreement is going to have shown up somewhere, you want to make sure whether their options have now expired and remove them from the stock option table. So those are all things that a very diligent person going through your data room will pick up, because they want to know who the people are and what they have and where their agreements are. And don't forget your advisors. So probably a lot of you have some advisors that have maybe formed a formal advisory board, or maybe are less formal arrangements. And if you have given them any expectation that they have stock options or some sort of interest in the company, you need to make sure that that is documented, that there are advisor agreements in place that detail that, and of course include confidentiality information, and make sure everyone's on the same page. Maybe they think they're getting paid somewhere down the road, but you've never thought that they were getting paid, for their advisory services. So make sure that all of those documents are done too. All right, note this down if you want. dentonsventurehub.com is our free platform. It's got a lot of startup information and some startup documents on it. You just shoot us your email and you're on the platform, and there's lots of great free information there. And that is my contact. And that's it. Those are my 10 biggest mistakes that people make. And now I'm all yours.
Thank you, Megan. That's really great. We're going to go straight to Q&A. We've already got hands up, but we got a clap going on, not a hands up. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to check in for a minute. You talked about all the things that need to be in your data room, and then the next layer is the judgment and the decision making behind how you reached those places, and investors are looking to de-risk all the time. So whatever they read, they're going to try to get a sense of where that founder's judgment is. When it comes to the relationship between a venture lawyer and other professionals, the other professional experts in a founder's sort of perimeter circle, how typically, what does that relationship look like? Is it sitting with Denton's, let's get your paperwork done? Or is there some like deeper kind of conversations going on about how you get the right things on these documents? Is that a good question? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, you're asking someone who has believed for over 20 years that that the biggest value add that professionals have, whether it's lawyers or financial advisors like Number Crunch, or working with other investment advisors, that our value is not in the paperwork we provide, but the advice and the sort of troubleshooting and our experience over time. So my answer is going to very obviously be that you should be looking for a relationship of trust with people who are experienced in dealing with this type of work. Do they need to be experts in your particular field? To some degree, it's helpful because there's different sort of investment interests in different buckets. So life sciences, we had a few people that were in that space. It's a really different investment thesis if you've got to invest in a company that's going to be going through clinical trials and taking several years to get through various processes with government regulation, than somebody who can build the best app ever. And, if you happen to hit the sweet spot that, is interesting to the public, if you're in the right place at the right time, you can scale your product really fast with the right team behind you. So having some experience like that in all your advisors is definitely helpful. Does it turn the tide with the investors? I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, no. I think your biggest risk on that front is if you have an advisor that's not willing to work collaboratively with your investors. So if there is a negotiation on terms, you want someone that's I believe that is going to work collaboratively with the investors and not turn them off with really aggressive deal terms. So I hope I've answered your question, but I do think it matters to work with an experienced team, but I don't believe it will determine things for the investor. So
Right.
that should make you feel better if I don't think an investor is going to leave a promising company because they don't see your counsel kind of out front and center. Ultimately, they're investing at this early phase in you. And I'm sure that's been a common conversation point across CANLABs, is they believe they're investing in you as much as your product. And frankly, I believe a well-organized and complete due diligence room says a lot about you as the founders and leaves the right first impression on that front.
Thanks. I will let you, do you want to just take the questions yourself directly from the room?
Yeah, sure. I'm just double checking. We don't have.
I'm not seeing anything in chat.
We don't have any in the chat. Okay. I'm gonna go left to right because I don't know when people put up their hands, but my left to right, I'm starting with Dave.
Hi, Megan, thanks. One question around your slide 4, which was the restrictions on founder shares and so on.
Yeah.
Is there a difference? Is the amount of the investment at a sort of a safe level? Like, what's the leverage that an investor has around sort of pushing down that level of sort of business change, I suppose? Like, if someone's giving me $30,000, like, why would I do all that? But
yeah, great question. And it runs beyond those beyond just that question. You know, I would say the best position you can find yourself in terms of what you're going to agree to in an investment round is to find a lead investor that's taking enough of the round that they can set the terms that you can live with. So if your first investor says, I'm giving you 30,000 of a $2 million raise, do not agree to terms with that person. Say, that's awesome. We'd love to have you on board. We'll come back to you when we get a lead investor, because whatever that person coming in at a small percentage of your raise might say, you don't want to set terms according to them. That said, sometimes that first initial investor might be somebody that's going to do a lot of introductions for you. So if they're willing to work with you without coming up with a term sheet yet, and help you build those relationships, that's better than having a term sheet that has a bunch of terms you don't want to live with, including potentially reverse vesting and other sort of onerous founder roles. But I've certainly seen reverse vesting requests in pre-seed and seed rounds. And really what they're trying to do is ensure that, particularly in a founder team, if you've got co-founders, that you don't have someone leave and just disproportionately own a chunk of the company before the value that they brought is really realized. So picture, you know, a typical reverse vesting term period might be 3 years. So if you put it into place when you're first starting your company and you have 3 co-founders, you know, you're all entitled, you all agree we're each going to have a third of the company. You want to make sure that everyone's actually contributed a third of the company by the time you get to that vesting threshold that you've set. And so the investor is thinking along the same lines. It's not to say that a sole founder isn't going to face a request for the same sort of restrictions on their shares. Particularly, I mean, if you're a sole founder and you decide to fold the company, it's probably not going anywhere. So the fact that you still own your shares doesn't really matter. Depending upon the investment terms, the investors may be able to take the company and sell off the assets that you've created so far. But they may still just as a habit even ask a sole founder to enter into reverse vesting. And then you're going to be entitled to whatever shares have vested, but you're going to have to sell back the balance of them. So I hope I haven't totally dodged your question, Dave, but
no, I was gonna, what about that? Are you talking more specifically around priced rounds, or is the same your same comments transferable around unpriced, safe, or convertible notes?
Yeah, you'll often find investors still want to see that. There's investors that just really believe in them, and really want to say, and especially at the early stage, because there's no value other than the founders in a lot of these companies yet, or there's maybe a bit of code, but they're really truly investing in you. And so there's just investors that say, yeah, they got to be tied to the company. And we want to make sure that that team is still around, or our money is just gone.
Thank you.
Okay, Nicholas was the next one on my cycle here.
I have a question. I have just a quick shameless plug for Denton's, because Denton's actually did our IP tech transfer assignment from the university, and it was a very, very easy experience. So they were they're very good at that.
That's great to hear. All right, David.
Thanks so much for the session today. Question I have is, I'm currently a solo founder, pre-revenue, and still filling out the market and also doing a lot of validation. But we've launched already, and we've also been getting a lot of traction as well. So my question borders around valuation. So in cases when the investors don't agree with the valuation, how do we go around with that? How do we go about that conversation with them?
Sorry, you mean the foundation, like how the company has been set up?
No, valuation.
Oh, valuation, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I love it when Susan's here to answer those questions for me. I always punt valuation questions. Listen, it is absolutely the toughest part of this. The easy answer really is at the early stage is you don't price the round. And then while there may be, so if you're doing a say for a convertible note, there is a cap that everyone has to agree to. It's really the whole purpose of those forms of investment is to push the valuation down the road, because when you are pre-revenue, it's very, very hard to value the company.
Yeah.
So that's my best advice, is to absolutely avoid a priced round.
Okay.
You know, that said, sometimes you can't escape it. Someone wants to do a priced round and you want their money and they're the only people at the table. And you have to come up with this fabricated value, frankly, for the company.
Okay.
And then it's pure negotiation, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, push it off as long as you can if you're not comfortable with it.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Walid.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. And my question is, I don't know if you had experience with companies from Quebec, because we have data that are in French, and also it will be probable that we'll pitch to investor that speak English. So are there like specific documents that you would say that we should focus on translating, and to make sure that we don't waste our time translating all the documentation?
Good question. My French is atrocious. I apologize for that. So I'm not. I always cringe when I see a great French company, a great Quebec company come along and their documentation is in French, because I can't support them. Quebec has some fantastic financing resources. So if you think you can build for a good period of time internally on Quebec or any of the other financing sources, then maybe you don't worry about it. But really, if you're going to go outside Quebec for financing, or your customers, which is likely, all your fundamental documents are going to need to be translated and maybe signed in English. Your customer contracts would be a big one, because you're outside of Quebec, your customers aren't obviously going to be able to sign something that they don't understand, and a translated version is maybe not ideal for them. Your company founding documents, your shareholders agreements, those things might be okay in French. And investors might be okay with a translation of those. Yeah, I think you want to take a look now at how deep you think you'll be able to go from a financing perspective in Quebec. And if you think you're going to tap out those resources, I would make the switch to English, unfortunately, as soon as you can, probably. I don't know, maybe Suzanne has a different perspective on that.
I mean, I think that just makes sense. The other thing is, it depends, like if you're going to be in just French speaking countries, but if your trajectory, if your projection for scaling the market includes others, it's going to send a sign when English speaking investors come in that you're not looking at a more global kind of business. So there is a message there. When is the question, right? At what point would you have to do that? And is everything, Megan, you would have more experience than I do. but just from like being in publishing, not everything's easily translated. The
Mhm.
essence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, internally, I would send it to my Montreal office if it came to me in French. So,
Okay.
so I'm not very helpful, unfortunately, on that question because that's my solution. And we would just, if it was, you know, if the document, certainly if the company was incorporated in Quebec, and definitely if most of the documentation was in French, we would be doing it out of our Montreal office. But certainly there's any number of bilingual or, you know, translation needs around the world, so.
So we would have to translate the incorporation document also, for instance.
No, I wouldn't say your incorporation documents. But if you have shareholders agreements that investors are going to be signing, I would take the lead from them. Maybe not rush to do them now, but if your investors ask for you to translate them, which they typically would.
Okay.
Yeah, and I am
Thank
just gonna
you.
take one moment to talk about customer contracts because that 10-point slide actually doesn't really touch on customer contracts. But some of you have customers already and have revenue. That is, of course, something that needs to be in your due diligence room and you'll be asked about. If you have not had legal help preparing your customer contracts or your terms of use, if it's a platform and your privacy policy, etc., that is something to invest in. Depending upon the investor, there may not be a really deep dive on those documentation, but it's not uncommon for, particularly if you're building an app or web-based platform, to have pulled your first terms of use from the internet and found somebody who does something similar to you. And it might be in a jurisdiction that doesn't apply, particularly around privacy policies. So it may not get picked up in the due diligence, but making sure that your current agreements look the way they should look. It's probably not going to turn off an investor, but they might say, hey, we need to update your customer contracts going forward. We want to make sure that when we reach the point of wanting to sell the company, all of us, that you've got contracts that do what they need to do, that you can assign them or you can transfer them and that sort of thing. So it's not like it's not remotely a deal killer, but do put a bit of time into starting to think about those things. If you don't yet have customer contracts, then get those right from the start. Oscar is next on my list. Now I think you're just on mute. We definitely don't have your audio still. No, you're off mute, but we can't hear you.
You can put your question in the chat if you want, Oscar.
Yeah, because I had.
Oh, we've got you now.
Hello.
There you are.
Yes, here I am. Okay.
I'm good, how are you?
I do believe that Kevin is on a. Okay, very good. Hi, Megan. First of all, thank you for and thank you for a great presentation. I'm gonna make an express presentation of my company because I wasn't able to do it. I'm CEO, CSO of Body Mechanics. We do biometric wearable technology for high-end athletes and people that perform on extreme environments. We are due diligence ready. We have been 7 years almost to the date right now on the making. We just signed our manufacturing in Montreal. So all our technology is made in Canada. We are a 9-strong team. I have other 3 co-founders that we have a subscription agreement. We have shares issued. Everything is made down to the last T. We have one legal challenge that we have already negotiated the dealing on how we're gonna be repaying that legal challenge. So it has been taken care of. My question is the following, because that legal challenge is in Quebec, and we were domiciliated in Quebec, but we brought the company to Ontario, to Ottawa. We closed our NEQ, our numéro d'entreprise du Québec. It's closed, so it has been radiated. We don't have anything to do with Quebec. How would that be perceived by any potential investor that would actually have interest into jumping into our company, taking into account that we're running right now a marketing campaign with sports that's huge. They're our partners. We have other International Triathlon Union is now our partner officially. So taking into account that balance, how would a potential investor take a look at our company on a serious basis, given the legal challenge that we have, that it's not encumbering, but it's something that might tilt us more into a kind of a let's wait and see scenario, because we're raising our pre-seed at this moment.
Yeah. So there's a couple answers to that. The fact that it's in another jurisdiction won't make anyone feel any better. I'll say that. But there's ways to deal with it. Obviously, companies have legal claims that you may want them to go away, and you may do everything you can to get them to go away, but there's somebody else involved, and you can't always make that happen, right? So there's different ways to deal with it. The really easy one is to create an indemnification for the investors around it. That sounds easy, but in fact, it's not necessarily as easy as it sounds, because how big is the litigation? You know, is it a claim to ownership? Is it an IP claim? Like it's
financial. It's a financial claim. It's not
Okay.
even IP. It's not ownership
Okay.
or control. It's just a financial claim, because they
Yeah.
didn't have a foot to stand on.
Yeah.
When they
Okay.
wanted to make any other of the claims, they were completely dismissed.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
came to it happened, but the only thing that they want is money, but they do not want the whole amount in one go. So
Yeah.
we negotiated with them to have a payment plan once
Yeah.
that we get an injection of capital.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of the best position to be in, is to be able to show that it's been settled, and there's terms of settlement, and then offer up, the founders offer up an indemnification around that nice boxed amount that they've claimed. It's when it's open-ended that it's scary to investors. And so if it's you know,
It's
you
already
didn't pay us your
been
contract
negotiated.
or whatever it is,
Yeah.
if it's sort of in a box, you can deal with it a little
Yeah.
more easy. Yeah.
Correct. Thank you very much.
Great, no problem. Nar.
Hey, Megan. So we've gotten some interest from the States. Do we need to have a separate data room for, for, let's say, international investors?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
If you have data, and probably for a startup, that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
If you're a more established company and there's any concern about where the data is being held, and in particular, when that would come up is if you have employee details that are going to go in the data room, or customer contracts, and your customers have been very picky about where their information is held, then you need to look at the jurisdiction of where the data is going to be domiciled. But I think I'm gonna guess for you at this stage, it's not an issue, and you don't need to worry about setting that up.
Okay. And just one more question while I have your ear. The documents that are in the data room, are there standardized templates, or like, do we just open up an Excel spreadsheet and a Word doc and just start writing stuff down?
So that's a good question. I think we circulated our Dentons, or Can circulated our Dentons list. So that's a fairly standard one. That being said, a particular investor may request the information in their form. So you may get an Excel spreadsheet from an investor where you need to answer every question in the Excel spreadsheet, even if it's, you know, no, not relevant, no, not relevant. And so you can't just say, go to my data room and figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
And so it can be frustrating because you put all this time into this nice data room, and I think Waleed is probably crying from what he said in his intro. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily as easy as my data room's up, it's done, because you will get a series of questions. And for the most part, it will be, they won't be asking for something that's not in your data room. There may be the odd thing that you're like, oh, I didn't know anyone would want that. I didn't put it in my data room. Okay, fine, put it in. It's more the legwork of answering these questionnaires. You can't really anticipate those in advance. They are what they are, and they're going to be in the format that they want. Some investors will just say, okay, we'll have our due diligence team go into your data room, go through it with their checklist. You never get a checklist from them. They're just going through your data room and they're making notes, asking for something that's missing. So it's not real templatable, but generally speaking, what they want to see is what's on our Denton's list.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really a comprehensive list.
You're absolutely right, Waleed.
There don't seem to be any more questions. We're coming to our time. Megan, before we close, is there anything that you want to leave the group with?
No, I mean, I think we can do, this is the session we've done today. I'm sure as you get into your investment round, the biggest questions that you're going to have are, what's normal? I'm being like, I was given this term sheet. Is this normal? Is this, you know, should I accept this? Can I do better? That's the hardest thing in your first fundraising rounds. And the first thing to know is there is no normal. There's no, like, investors tend to ask for this, but it's, you know, I have companies that have never sold a share outside of their two founders, and now somebody wants to buy a priced round, and like, your first round isn't always a safe round. Like, it's, unfortunately, it's all over the place. And so I think having somebody to talk to you about what you can expect is really important. You can do everything in advance on due diligence and get all your paperwork in place, but making sure you have someone that you can get a sense of whether the first term sheet you get is the one that you should commit to, is going to be the most important thing for you.
Absolutely, because you've set the bar.
Yeah.
It's Megan, thank you so much. For those of you fortunate enough to be joining us at Denton's on the 21st for the CANLABs Investor Founder Boutique Summit. It's going to be very special in the boardroom at Denton's with some other folks there from Megan's team as well. And following this, Sarah will send out a link for you to follow on with Megan and her team, or her team, however that may shake out, however that makes sense. Just know that now you have a new friend. Her name is called Megan. She's awesome. And she's really smart. And yeah, Waleed, she likes that paperwork stuff. So great to have somebody like that around. Super knowledgeable. You know, she's helped companies that are scaling in Ottawa that are famous, that are really well known. And she is, I've worked with her before at CAN. She makes life simple. She's a breeze to work with. So that's awesome. So we'll see you at the one-on-ones, the open office hours. And for those of you, again, coming on the 21st, we'll see you there. If you are raising or you're getting close to raising, don't forget that you can apply at Capital Angel Network. And then you'll see Megan again because she's on our selection committee. We didn't mention.
Well,
So-
I want to try to get through this really fast because I want.
Somebody's talking. Maybe that was to somebody else. Anyways, thank you very much, Megan, for supporting this program, for hosting us on the 21st, and for sharing so generously of your time. Cheers. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Amir, just, I don't know if you're still here. You asked for the RSVP. We send the link for CanLabs Summit. If you register on that link, we will send an invitation on your calendar also.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you. Have a great
so much
day.
for taking the time with us. I think we're losing everybody, so cheers. Sarah, do you want to hang back for a sec? I gotta
Yes.
jump onto another call actually, but I just want to touch base.
Thank you, Susan. Have a good one.
Take care. Thank you so
Bye,
much.
Sarah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Okay, are we just us? Okay. People are slow to get out.
I had to remove
So,
one of them. I wish.
Oh, you did? Okay, I was going to, and then it was like asking me to report them. And that wasn't what I want to do. Yeah, I think I just kind of, for the people that aren't going to CANLABs, it might be a little bit of a short, but we didn't really kind of wrap it up as the end of the program. So let's think about survey. I still have some work to do, but I saw that there's quite a few investors actually coming to the Investing in AI. But I got to jump off now. I've got one founder that's up tomorrow in selection, and I've got it. This is my last final coaching. Do you need
Okay.
anything from me right now?
I have a question about the email I want to send to partners, but I can wait and I can ask it later after your meeting.
Oh, just jump in if it's quick.
For the email I want to send, this one is only for the deal flow, or I send it to both deal flow and partners
I think deal flow,
because they
'cause
have two lists.
some of the people and partners aren't going to want to be hearing from you every month about your deadline. So community partners really is for, hey, this is what's going on if you'd like to share it with your network. And deal flow are really those people that have maybe an accelerator. They've got a number of founders with them. It's not like they know one or two. They
Okay.
know founders and where they're at and who's raising and what stage they're at. That's the
Okay.
difference. Does that make
And
sense?
yeah, I understand. If you want to go, you can go, but I have still one question about this.
Ask me quickly because I don't want you waiting. on
Yeah, you asked me to send my link to them for if they want to have like a 15 minutes meeting. Because of Brian's one-on-ones, I still have my own personal calendar integrated with HubSpot. So if I give them the link, it will send the invitation with my personal calendar. Is there's no problem with that?
It's fine. It doesn't matter.
Okay, no, I wanted to just check because it's an
Yeah, no, it's a
organization.
good question. As long as it works for you. I mean, yeah, because I mean, I think it's easier. I changed that letter around a little bit, so it was
Yeah.
less you asking and more you providing.
Okay. Okay,
But
great.
it's pretty much the same content. Okay, I gotta go, Miss.
Bye-bye.
missed the guy at 3:15 actually. I was writing your email. But okay, cheers. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.